I'm going to talk about output routing for WaveRazor. It's a pain, and you have the opportunity to be double monitoring, and there are various ways of balancing between the main mix and the effects mixing, and the whole thing's a little bit confusing. So to simplify it, what I've done here is I've set up the init patch, I've closed off oscillators 2 and 3, and just have oscillator 1, and I changed it to a sawtooth wave all around, just so that it would be a little more apparent as we mess around with it. It's a bright, kind of ugly sound. So let's go into the edit window. And one thing to notice right away is if we go to the oscillators, there's this little mute button on the oscillators here. When you have oscillators shut off in the front, they're muted here. And this is a good way to kill the sounds of oscillators to whatever oscillators you want to kill while you're focusing on the sound from one instead of having to go all the way back to the first. So now what we're going to do is we're going to route from oscillator 1 to filter 1. So, but even before that, we're going to look at the main ADSR for the whole thing. There's one ADSR, like an amp ADSR, that everything goes through. And that's going to be one amp ADSR1, it's called. And there are two sections to it, amp ADSR and voice amp. Voice amp is really important because this is where the routing stuff happens. This top section is like master sends for the mix bus and for the sends. I've prepped it with everything closed except the mix bus. Below it is the same kind of thing, but for the envelope, that is the main envelope, which also has a set of master controls. So basically, these master controls here are routing into these master controls here, which then in turn go to the output mixer. So basically, the sequence of events is you have from whatever your amp envelope is, it sends to the voice amp up here, which goes to the output. That's a really important concept to get. So what we'll do though is, as long as we're here, we'll do a quick modulation on the filter just so we see how that works. This is really important. There are two types of amplifier envelopes that you can do in this. If you go to the amp section and you go to amp envelopes, you can add a second or third amp envelope here, and what that's going to do is give you the opportunity to route all the parameters of a oscillator and filter combination independent of the others. So if you plan to do something where you have one effect for one oscillator and another effect for another oscillator completely, you have to do it by separating out the amp envelopes. And the reason for that is that here, when you look at the oscillator mixer, you see that you have like all of your filter 1s across these first 2 rows, filter 2s across these 2 rows, and filter 3s, and so on. So if you're sending everything to filter 1 or filter 2, you can't really easily get the you can't start separating these signals out at a certain point. So let's stick with 1, and you'll see the example for what that is. So what we have here is we have oscillator 1 going to filter 1, oscillator 2, oscillator 3 are turned off everywhere, which is good because we don't want to mess with those. What's nice when we see this oscillator mix window here, we're actually seeing the filter that is associated with it, in this case filter 1, and it shows us our cutoff and resonance and mode. And on the other side, it shows us the 3 oscillators and their levels and step sizes and all that. So they're trying to give us information that's convenient in the mix window. In the oscillator window, you have a choice. You can see your mods, your controls, your input, or your matrix, which is kind of good because then you can see anything in the matrix that applies to that oscillator shows up here. These are input columns, these are output columns. So the oscillator, anything from the matrix is controlling the oscillator. The oscillator output is going into showing you what's on the right, which in this case is going to this filter. So it's actually logical. So if I play this and I change this, I can hear the change in the filter cutoff. So let's modulate the filter cutoff. So to modulate the filter cutoff, it's important we go to mods. We know we're going to set up an envelope to do it. You have to set up the envelope from the mod section as opposed to the amp section, which would really screw you up. So you go to the mod section, click on voice mods because you have a choice of different things. And the main, under amp envelopes, you see the main amp envelope for everybody. Go to voice mods, and we see there are two there already. There's the vibrato LFO, and there's the envelope for everything, which has all these various controls. Now we're going to tell it to add another envelope. It comes up here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to rename it envelope ADSR, and we're going to call it filter 1 cutoff, because that's what we're going to use it for, and this way it'll be easy to see what it is. So there it is. So let's set it so that it does something that might make sense. We'll kill the sustain level, give it a little attack, a little bit of a decay, like a tiny little bit of decay. So give it a little less, like 3/4 of a second of attack, and about a 1 sec, a really short decay, because they're short notes, and we should hear an effect of it after we assign it in the matrix. So we go to the matrix, add 1xn root, that's what I always do. Our modulator is filter 1 cutoff. Go to output, and we're going to add a destination, which in this case is going to be our filter 1 cutoff, and everything's there. Now, what's kind of cool is that when it's sitting here in the voice matrix mode and shows you all these various matrices here, it actually lets you see various controls and the modulations, and the matrix nothing there, but the modulations are here. So here I actually see my envelope controls. So while I'm adjusting the level, the amount of envelope effect it has by the output of the envelope and the input into the cutoff, I'm actually able to adjust the envelope here. So I'm not hearing a whole lot. So let's go back to our filter and crank the resonance a little and lower that. So now we got your classic quacking fist filter thing. And again, what's nice is that the filter's sitting here, so I can adjust the various parameters that are part of it. Okay, so now we have this quick sound. It's coming out, and there's no effect. So for routing, we're going to add an effect. So we're going to go to delay. I'm going to give it a little less than a half a second delay, so we hear it well. Give it feedback so it's obnoxious, and the delay is ready. So we go back to our amp section, which is where we're going to be doing all the routing from, and we hear nothing in there. So we look at the master everything, and effect 1 send is closed. So now we're going to open effect 1 send here. Now we have to go down to the amp ADSR, which is feeding into that one above it, and we have to open the send here also, in which case we will play it and still hear nothing. What's happening now is that the signal is going out of this main envelope, the effects send, and the mix bus as 2 separate things. And that's really important to know. The effects send is not feeding into the mix bus anywhere. It's after it's totally separate. So now we go to output, and we see in our main output mixer, we have just the mix bus open. Now if I put effects 1 return in with it, finally we hear the delay, which is totally obnoxious. Now, to adjust the amount of delay, we can change the return, or we can change the send. And that's kind of a normal thing. Now, the effect also has this dry level and wet level business in it, and this is where you can really get screwed up. If you have the dry level on anything other than 0, the dry level is going to be feeding as if it's part of the main out. So it's not going to be really just diminishing the effect of the delay. It's actually just going to be sending more dry signal into the effect bus, which is going to be adding to the mix bus. So from a gain structure point of view, it's a totally funky way of doing things that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. So that takes messing around with. So just multiply all of this by 3, and you can figure out how to send different effects for different things. Sometimes you might want to close the mix bus on something and just have it coming through the effect, and balance from within the effect, balance the amount of dry and wet. Like on a chorus, that might give you more control that if you're trying to run the chorus output through the separate effects bus and mix it with the mix bus. It's just more difficult. Anyway, that's the whole thing. I know it's lengthy, but it explains it, I hope.